and glory belongs, after which we send endless greetings of love, praise, and peace upon the master of mankind, the very best of creation. He is, of course, Muhammad Mustafa, Rasulullah, Habibullah, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Ramadan FM listeners, distinguished honorable listeners, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May peace and blessings be showered upon each and every one of you in absolute abundance during these glorious last few days of Ramadan 2024. I hope you're all well. I hope you're getting into the swing of things as Eid is now around the corner, inshallah. Not long to go. I was just saying to Brother Akil in the studio that it feels like the vibe is changing already. People are back to school, everybody's back to work, and that humdrum routine is now firmly back in place. But inshallah, we still have a couple of days, which means there's still plenty of time for you to make dua, inshallah. Don't feel like you haven't done enough, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will accept whatever you do, inshallah. So yes, keep going until the absolute very end. And this is another episode of Talking Heads, and I am very, very excited and very, very honored to welcome our guest today into the Ramadan FM studios. He is the award-winning author, travel writer, journalist. He was given the 2022 British Guild of Travel Writers Adele Evans Award for his book Minarets of the Mountains. He's the author of many Lonely Planet guides, producer of award-winning radio shows for the BBC World Service, as well as a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. He's come up with countless heritage trails for Islam in the UK, and he is one of the most influential British Bangladeshi voices that we have. I am, of course, talking about none other than Brother Tariq Hussain. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam, Irfhan. Thank you for such an amazing build-up. I'm now terrified of what I have to deliver.
Listen, no pressure, no fear, but it's all true. I mean, mashallah, I've not even included half of the accolades and the nominations that you've achieved, mashallah. So listen, thank you so much for joining us today on Talking Heads. How are you, first of all?
Alhamdulillah, very good. As you were saying to your listeners, now getting into the mindset that Eid is around the corner. I still haven't done my shopping. I have to get the clothes for the children. I have to get the mitai and all of these things. So yeah, just trying to wind down and get ready for the big festivities that brings this blessed month to an end.
I tell you what, I was scared to enter our kitchen yesterday because the missus was going on a bake-a-thon, right? It was just flour and butter and things everywhere. So I totally get where you're coming from. But how's your Ramadan been? What's a typical Ramadan in the Hussein household?
Well, it's been a really interesting one for me. For the obvious reason is that I actually published a book this year called Ramadan Mubarak.
Yes.
So instead of being a very private affair as it has been historically, it's been much more of a kind of I found myself in the public domain a lot more. I've gone and done a lot more events, I've given a lot more talks than I would. I went on a whole kind of mini book tour. And so it's been quite exciting in many ways, but also quite exhausting as well, because of course, to try and do all of that whilst trying to retain some degree of focus in making sure Ramadan is observed as much as you can as a family, it's been a tough one. And I think next year I'm going to be looking for a better balance. But this year, I really wanted to try and get the message of the book out to people, and to try and help others certainly have a much more immersive and much more fruitful Ramadan.
So let's talk a little bit about your latest book. It was published at the turn of the year, so a few months before Ramadan actually started, and it is called Ramadan Mubarak. What
That's
was
right.
the inspiration behind the book?
So the book actually wasn't my idea. It was something that came about because I had written a series called The Hajj Diaries for Lonely Planet a little while back, where essentially I wrote about my journey to the Hajj with my mother and her twin, in a series of diary entries, and they were published as articles on Lonely Planet. And then it was such a successful piece that it got picked up by Summersdale, the publisher, for
Mm-hmm.
their anthology, The Best British Travel Writing of the 21st Century. And obviously, this told them that I was comfortable not just writing about journeying as a Muslim, but I was comfortable writing about my faith. And so they, off the back of that, they approached me, and when they approached me, they knew that this isn't what I normally do. This is a, the book I'm talking about here is a gift book. It's small. It's there's no narrative structure to it. It's a series of verses of the Quran, hadith, quotes by various Muslims past and present, as well as my own collection of tips and socio-historical contexts for Ramadan. So it's almost like a guide for people through the month, something that they can lean on, something that they can dip into. And it's not what I normally do. So when the publisher approached me, they said, look, Tariq, we know this isn't what you normally write, this isn't normally your kind of thing, but would you be interested? And at first, I dismissed it as, I do travel, I do history, this isn't what I'm about. And then the more I thought about it, Irfan, the more I actually realized this is a wonderful opportunity to bring forth the absolute best of Islam, because as we all know, the reason we love Ramadan is because it embodies the essence of Islam. All the things that we consider to be beautiful about this faith, giving, being charitable, community, spiritual elements of worship, all of these things are what Ramadan is essentially about. And I realized that in putting together a book about Ramadan, I would also be putting forward a book about the beauty of Islam. Plus, this is a mainstream publisher, and I very much my work speaks to the non-Muslims much more in some ways than the Muslims. My primary audience is to reach out to those who may not understand Islam thoroughly, who may have misconceptions, who may have various misunderstandings. And so this was again another opportunity to put together something that might appeal quite a lot
And
to a
what's the response
non-Muslim
been from
audience.
by the non-Muslim community or your non-Muslim friends and within your circles?
Hmm. Sorry, what was the beginning of that question?
Just wanted to know what the response has been by the
Oh, it's
non-Muslims.
been fantastic. The books sold very, very well, not just with Muslims, but also non-Muslims. A lot of my non-Muslim friends have said how they felt like there were so many universal and pan-religious messages in there,
Mm.
the kind of things that we would normally find in a book, maybe on meditation, in a book about well-being, in a book about mental health, and they felt like these were the kind of messages that were coming through in this book. The other thing that really, really appealed to a lot of people is the fact that I consciously went out of my way to include at least as many female voices as male voices. And this, I think, is something in the past we've been quite negligent of. We have a wealth of amazing female teachers, poets, activists, mystics throughout history who have been poorly documented. And this isn't an exclusively Islamic community problem. This is a problem in most communities. And so for a lot of my female family members, friends, including the non-Muslims, to find a book that is considered Islamic literature where the balance is almost equal has
Yes.
really also been quite inspiring.
Excellent. Fantastic. I need to go and get this book. Alhamdulillah, inshallah. So that will be in my Eid gift wish list, no doubt. Let's talk a bit about your book, Minarets of the Mountains, which was awarded the Adele Evans Award 2022. First of all, Mubarak, congratulations. That's an
Thank you.
incredible achievement for a Muslim male author, writer. Were you surprised by that?
Yes, I guess the award that you're talking about was something that by that point I was like, am I going to win one finally? Because actually, the biggest surprise came when it was longlisted for the biggest non-fiction prize in the country, the Bailey Gifford. Now, this was just absolutely beyond my wildest imaginations. So, for our listeners, most of them will not have heard of the Bailey Gifford, but they will have heard of the Booker. Now,
Yes.
the Booker Prize is the one that everyone knows, but the Booker Prize is exclusively fiction. The Bailey Gifford is the equivalent non-fiction. So to have a debut narrative book, a non-fiction book, a travel book that is considered in at the time to be in the top 10 in the country completely blew my mind. And that was beyond anything that I could have imagined or expected or dreamt of. And then it was shortlisted for the biggest travel award, which is the Edward Stanford Travel would. And so when I missed out on both of those, I was getting to a point where I was hoping that, am I going to win one? And then, of course, like you say, the Adele Evans comes along and I win that. And like I said at the beginning, at the top of the program, it's the fact that these awards are primarily non-Muslim awards. These awards are judges tend to be non-Muslim, the readers tend to be non-Muslim. So it's exactly the audience I was trying to appeal to. So that success, of course, is from Allah, but it's precisely what I was dreaming of. And to be, in that category was phenomenal.
Alhamdulillah, and I'm sure it's going to be the first of many, many, many awards
Inshallah.
of that stature and that nature. Now, the book Minarets of the Mountains is a look back of the rich history, and some of our listeners may not be aware, but within Europe, Islam was highly influential, was highly prevalent. I mean, I'm involved with a charity here in Leicester called Rahma Mercy, which serves the Balkan region following the demise of the communist regime,
Hmm.
where prior to communism, that area was a hotbed of Islamic activity, of Islamic scholars coming out of there. We talk about Albania, which saw under communism the destruction of over 1,500 masajids. What was your inspiration behind writing this book?
So the inspiration behind it was, frankly, it was a family road trip that we did in 2016, the famous year of Brexit, of course, where we were traveling through the 6 Balkan countries, three of which are quote unquote Muslim countries. And prior to doing that particular journey, my family and I and myself, often solo, would travel to various parts of Europe to explore the Islamic heritage.
Mhm.
And then I would write about it in the form of articles, in the form of travel pieces. But when I was writing this particular journey, I realized that I was experiencing and I was in the midst of an indigenous European Muslim community. And I
Mhm.
felt like that was something that was not a normalized part of our conversation or understanding of what we consider to be Europe. So whilst the journey was going on, it dawned on me that what I was experiencing was something potentially within a book. Plus the fact that I was following in the footsteps of the 17th century Ottoman traveler Evliya Çelebi, it gave me a wonderful narrative device
Right.
to remind people, to remind the readers that what I was traveling through was, in essence, in the past, Muslim Europe, because almost all of it in that region that we now popularly know as Eastern Europe, it was, of course, ruled by the Ottomans. And
Mhm.
as a result, there are indigenous European Muslim communities in all of those countries. Serbia has a large indigenous European Muslim community. North Macedonia has it. Montenegro has it. And of course, as I said, Bosnia, Albania, and Kosovo are quote unquote Muslim countries.
And that's interesting because I think growing up for me, certainly, it was in the late 90s when communism fell in those regions. And up until that point, I suppose the narrative or the perspective that was put forward is that these were traditionally Judeo-Christian countries. Yes, where
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
for me as a British-born, Leicester-born Asian, we would never imagine that the history of Islam in those countries and what Islam brought to that region in terms of the socio-economic, political factors.
Mm.
It's mind blowing, and now with my work that I'm involved with the charity, you understand just how embedded Islam was in those areas. I mean, Albania was known as the second Medina, which was quite remarkable.
Mhm. Absolutely. Oh, without a shadow of a doubt, we are talking about a region where there is a whole body of scholarship. There is a whole, series of Islamic heritage sites. There's literally 6 centuries of Muslim heritage sitting in this region that most of us in the Western hemisphere of Europe do not really appreciate at all. And one of the reasons is because of the power of the narrative. Historically, when we think of Europe, we have been told that Europe is really what we consider to be Western Europe. Because if you were to go and tell any person on this planet that Europe has Muslim countries, they're going to look at you like you've lost your
Yeah,
marbles. Because
absolutely.
this narrative is so powerful that there are no Muslim countries in Europe. There are no indigenous European Muslims. And one of the ways in which this has been done is by othering this part of Europe. And
Hmm.
it's something that many people will tell you has come about because, oh, it was behind the Iron Wall, it was communist. This is why we call it Eastern Europe. You know, it's different to the rest of Europe. Actually, when you look at the historic literature written about this part of Europe, especially when it was under Ottoman domain, that's when the othering began. So
Hmm.
the problem hasn't been that it's Eastern Europe because it was in the East where communism is. It's called Eastern Europe because it was always Muslim Europe. And this is what the Western half of Europe, the part of Europe that we know as Europe proper, is really uncomfortable with. And for me, one of the problematic aspects of this is that by othering this part of Europe, what Western Europe is doing is it is distancing itself from its indigenous Muslim self. And it is able to convince people around the globe that Europe is primarily a Judeo-Christian entity, which in itself is deeply problematic, Irfan, and frustrating for me because that suggests some kind of cozy alliance. You know,
Yes.
does nobody know what the historic Christians did to the Jews in Europe? Absolutely. If you look at the Judeo-Christian history of Europe, it's horrific. But if you look at the Muslim Jewish history of Europe,
It
now
is.
there's something that is worth singing songs about and writing poetry about. In fact, the Jews did write poetry about it because they had some of their most amazing cultural, you could say Renaissance even, you know, under the Muslim rule
Mhm.
in Europe.
Very,
So,
very
so
cohesive
you know,
alliance that was, wasn't it?
absolutely. And so for me, there are many aspects of this dichotomy that has been created that are deeply, deeply problematic. And the book tries to unpick some of that to show A, how it's been created, and B, how it is helping to fuel modern Islamophobia in Europe.
Okay. On that, I'm fascinated and compelled to ask you about the journalistic aspect of your work. Um, it's I think it's quite clear to say that what you write and what you produce acts to serve as a counter to the mainstream narrative or perspective put forward around Islam and its teachings. How, you know, we all know that there is a line that journalists take, or there's a line that certain media outlets take in terms of pushing a certain point across. How
Mhm.
difficult has it been for you as a journalist to get your work published or seen as a counterbalance to the argument put forward?
It's been very, very difficult because I'm working in genres that have been historically dominated by white middle class males.
Hmm.
To be blunt, so especially travel writing. If you look at the historic travel writers from from the Byrons through to the Patrick Lee Fermers, to the William Dalrymples, I'm not saying all of them are problematic. I admire a lot of William Dalrymple's work, but I'm saying that it tends to be middle class, middle aged white men. And so if you have only this tiny narrow, very, very tiny demographic offering you a lens on the world, it turns into a very skewed lens. Now, the most disastrous thing about this is that these lenses have been presented as somehow objective. In other words, when a certain individual travels across the globe, a white male travels across the globe and tells us what India is like, tells us what, in this case, Eastern Europe is like, the rest of us have absorbed this as gospel, that this is somehow an objective truth. And of course, it's not. It's just their truth. And so, one of the things that I've had to do to get my voice heard, and it's not easy because sometimes when people realize actually my work is deeply political, they distance themselves from it.
Hmm.
When they first think of it as travel writing, they're like, oh, excellent. Travel writing is this nicey, nicey thing, this soft,
Quite
lovable
light and airy, yes.
genre.
Yeah.
It's not going to offend anybody. And then they hear what I have to say. And I have found that as a result, I'm not always necessarily invited back to certain talks, or I'm not invited back to certain shows. And then there's others who have really embraced it because they can see that I'm doing what most modern people, I'm sorry, what most modern commentators would consider to be decolonizing travel writing, decolonizing history. And all I'm doing is I'm not trying to suggest that what has been written is necessarily wrong, although there are problematic versions out there, obviously. But I'm saying that you just have not heard what it's like when a Muslim looks at this.
Hmm.
And when a Muslim looks at this part of Europe, he does not see a foreign invader 1400 years later, he sees his heritage, or she sees her heritage. In the case of my wife and my children, who are obviously who are also part of the journey, are actually in the book. So we have a host of lens in this book that historically do not appear in these discussions. And I think this is what really captured the imagination of many non-Muslim readers, and why it was so critically acclaimed.
Okay, you're listening to Ramadan FM. It's Talking Heads with me, Brother Irfan, and our very special guest, author and travel writer and journalist, Brother Tariq Hussein. If you've got a comment or a question you'd like to ask Tariq, please drop me a text on 077 488 55055. It's absolutely fascinating, compelling stuff, and we're very, very grateful that Tariq has decided to join us today. So let's sort of go back in time a little bit now, Tariq. And I don't know, 30 years ago, whatever it was, you're a teenager, you've got aspirations of becoming a writer. What was that? Where did your influence, your inspiration come from growing up? And I'm guessing, you know, as a British Bangladeshi, you must have been bombarded by lots of, you know, inspiration, lots of cultural noise, all these things, which I suppose has added into your masala of writing.
Yeah, there are many things that we can talk about, from the very, very simplistic, being able to go and spend hours in a beautiful library like the one I grew up with here in the East End of London. I recently went and gave a talk at that very library, which has survived, you know, in spite of certain governments trying to close all these wonderful institutes down. Being I was born in Bangladesh, so I'm effectively an immigrant as well. I'm not just a son of immigrants, I am an immigrant. Now, growing up in those kind of circumstances, in the kind of poverty that we experienced as first generation immigrants, we didn't have access to books. We couldn't buy all those books and have them in our homes. And so to have those libraries was wonderful. And to be able to go and just read and escape and travel, you could argue in the same way young people do on their smartphones, to be able to do it in those kind of institutes was wonderful. And, you know, I fondly remember my early books, the kind of things that really, you know, grabbed my imagination were things like Tintin and Asterix, which I'm sure you
Yes.
remember reading as well. And the flights of fantasy that you could take with the boy reporter, or the two indomitable Gauls that would travel the world and take on the might of the Holy Roman Empire and whatever else. And these were kind of the early influences. And then there was the political atmosphere that I found myself in, you know, being arriving and growing up in a country where, outside of that that little localized Bangladeshi bubble, it was a country that was rejecting you.
Yeah.
It was a country that was telling you to go home. It was a country that was saying to you that they don't want you here. And yet I didn't understand, firstly, why was I here? And why don't they want me here? You know, of course, our parents can talk about, oh, we're here because of this reason and that reason, but I didn't really understand. And so as I got older, I also began to study this area, you know, in trying to unpack who I was. And so I ended up doing post-colonial studies. I ended up doing cultural studies. And at this point, I'm also coming across people like Edward Said. I'm coming across Stuart Hall. And then I remember one of the most profound moments on my undergrad was when my lecturer dropped a paper in front of me to read. And it was by the Sri Lankan thinker A. Sivanandan, and it was the title of the paper that kind of blew me away. It was so simplistic and yet so profound. It said, "We are here because you were there." And up
Wow.
to that point, nobody had told me this, Irfan. Nobody had told me this. Nobody had told me the whole reason we ever ended up over here was because for centuries this country had gone over there and done and committed tons of atrocities. Nobody had ever told me any of this. And it was a powerful, powerful moment. So all of those were influences, but from a travel literature perspective, it was encountering Ibn Battuta. You know, and I have I owe a lot to Tim McIntosh Smith, not just because he was the one who translates Ibn Battuta in a kind of palatable way, in a accessible way, but also because he's been a great supporter of my work since. And he, you know, he said some wonderful things about my book when I asked him to review it. But Tim McIntosh Smith gave us Ibn Battuta, and suddenly I realized that the books I was reading, the William Dalrymples, the Bill Brysons, the Colin Thu Bronze, it wasn't just white, middle-aged, privileged males that did this. Once upon a time, brown Muslims did it as well, you know, and this realization made me think, hold on a minute, why did we stop doing this? Where are these great rihlas gone?
And I think
you
that's
know,
that's a really
and I guess
important
that was a
point,
defining moment. Yes.
because if we look at our Islamic heritage, Islamic history, it's filled with a cultural tapestry of the arts, of writers, of poets, people who, like you say, use their ability to escape and then put that down into the written word. And you know, we have philosophers like Rumi and all those great scholars of the past. And somehow it feels like, I don't know if it's right to say that we've lost that, but we've certainly, it's become diluted, and there's been a shift away from that. Um, would you agree with that?
You know, I think to say it was lost, it's not being physically lost, of course.
Yes,
I think what's been lost is the tradition of
the emphasis
appreciating
on it.
it.
Yeah.
You see, I don't know about yours, but as a South Asian, I can take a pretty informed guess as to what your Islamic education was like early on, and I assume it would have been deeply focused on learning the Quran and learning the fiqh of how
Yes.
to be a Muslim. And even then, it's probably certainly in my case, it was quite a redacted version. I didn't learn nothing about Islamic history. I didn't learn nothing about the Islamic heritage that I had across the globe,
Hmm.
not just in, you know, not just in the Arabian Peninsula, but across the globe. I didn't learn about who Ibn Khaldun was. I didn't learn about Ibn Battuta. I didn't learn about any of this. And I think that's what we've lost. We've lost the appreciation of our own intellectual heritage. If we make the appreciation of our own intellectual heritage a normalized part of our education as Muslims, you will see people puffing out their chests much more earlier than I did.
Uh-huh.
You'll see people who are much more comfortable knowing the giants, the absolute, you know, huge giants whose shoulders we are standing on. At the moment, we don't even know who they are.
Uh-huh.
And that's part of the problem. And within the travel genre, the minute I began to appreciate Ibn Battuta, you know, in my next book, I'm going to deal with Ibn Jubair, you know, Evliya Chelebi, Al Harawi, all of these. The minute I realized who these individuals were, I was no longer on dodgy ground.
Hmm.
I was on
Hmm.
the shoulders of magnificent giants. You know, Ibn Battuta traveled 3 times the distance of Marco Polo. And if you talk about historic travel, all you hear about is Marco Polo in the West. Here I had my own hero who had done 3 times that distance. You know, and so I think an appreciation of our heritage in whatever discipline, and obviously in my case, it's primarily history and travel. In whatever discipline, the more we appreciate it, you know, Muslim doctors, if they knew the Muslim medical heritage, they would
Yes.
be standing with their shoulders much more broader.
Absolutely.
It's I think that's the issue.
Um, so on that, and you know, you touched upon about the challenges within the industry and the domain in which you're working in and your profession. Was there any pushback growing up as a young Bangladeshi man around your love for the arts and your love for writing and your love for exploring? Were you encouraged, or were you trying to be actively dissuade from following that as a pursuit?
No, it wasn't I don't think I could be dissuaded because I wasn't doing any of it. You know, we came from a community where you didn't travel. Travel wasn't something you did for leisure. You know, travel was an absolute luxury, and it was what other people did.
Yes.
You know, if you traveled, you went back home. That was what they saved their money. You know, our parents saved their money, and that had a very specific purpose. That
Mm.
was to keep you connected to your roots, to keep you connected to your heritage, to your history, so you know where you come from. And of course, you and I both know our parents lived with the imminent fear that at any minute they could be kicked out.
Yes.
So they were always like, you know, don't forget where your roots are, because they could tell you to go home. And we know there are lots of people still saying that right now.
It's
So
it's a
I
weird
wasn't
self-fulfilling
able.
prophecy, isn't it, at the moment?
Yes, absolutely. So I wasn't really someone who was able to fully appreciate that as a young person, but certainly when I got into my later years, and you know, I became the huge disappointment for not becoming a doctor, an engineer, or a lawyer, you know, in South Asian culture. It was difficult for my family to appreciate why is he interested in these things? Why does he want to write? You know, what's writing going to achieve? Because of course, our parents coming from extreme poverty,
Mm.
the first thing they want to see for you is financial security, you know, because they know that without it, it's very, very difficult to survive in this globalized capitalist world, and they appreciated that. So yes, it was difficult for them to understand, and there was a bit of pushback, but in a without kind of trying to patronize any of my family, in a way it was also an education for them. You know, I was somebody who was suddenly reading Bengali poets like Tagore, the most famous, of course, everybody knows Rabindranath Tagore, but I also wanted to read Qazi Nazrul Islam, and then I wanted to read Hassan Raja, and these were voices that are part of our Bangladeshi culture, but
Mm.
were not being appreciated by our community. And I'm going to be blunt here as well. That is also because the Sylheti Bangladeshi community here in the in the East End of London, we are primarily a community that comes from rural Bangladesh.
Mhm.
We're not a middle class. We don't come from a community of people who are highly educated, and so it's the second and third generation that are really stepping into those kind of arenas, and it is new territory for us. And as you know, anything new, anything that is a big change is always scary for people. So you did get a little bit of pushback from the community and from your own parents, only because they didn't know what this was.
That everything you said totally resonates with me on a personal level. As a kid growing up here in Leicester, I really enjoyed the arts. Growing up
Mm,
as a youngster, I was very conflicted because I enjoyed things like drama. I loved
mm,
writing, creative stories, those sorts of things. Storytelling. I think storytelling, that there is an art to storytelling, and it can be so powerful in many, many different domains. Um, and I think that art, is somewhat dying within our community. The ability to tell stories, because stories is what connects people. It's what
absolutely.
you think. Okay, well, I can relate to that. That deeply connects with you on so many levels.
Mm.
And I felt complete because I felt guilty for wanting to enjoy the arts, and I'm sure you can understand what I'm coming from
Yes, of
here, Tariq.
course,
Yeah.
because we're often, we're often led to believe that pure Islam, the Islam that goes back to the first generation, is some kind of puritanical, devoid of any beauty, any art, any kind of enjoyment of these things. And of course, when you look into history, you realize that actually that's nonsense. There are obviously some communities within the broader Islamic community that did feel that way, but actually we have such a wealth of appreciation of the arts, appreciation of culture, appreciation of heritage throughout our traditions. And again, I come back to this thing that if we knew our history in this way, maybe we wouldn't put ourselves in the straitjackets that some of our communities did early on, with a much more quote unquote conservative look at these things. Now you can't walk into a mosque without bumping into a geometric pattern. you know you can't move for a nasheed singer.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so we've clearly broken out of it, and we're coming out of that. But I absolutely know where you're coming from. Listening to music was perceived as haram, and certain imagery was haram. Even taking photos for some people were considered haram. So all of this was being bandied around, but I think it was being bandied around without anybody really appreciating what had been and gone in our history.
Fantastic. Sorry, my son's trying to call me while I'm away. It's just classic, right? Um,
Yes, he should be watching the show. What's he doing? I mean, you should
he's
know,
at he's
right?
at he's at college, or supposedly. Well, he did say he wants to go and get a fresh trim, but it's like that. Um, so I think now we've got a few minutes left of the show. If you've got a comment for Brother Tariq or a question, please text us in 07748855055. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, something that we could go on for hours and hours and hours and hours, purely by sort of the angles that we can go down to explore. But I'm really fascinated to understand a bit more about what advice you would give young people now who are thinking about following in your footsteps. As you said, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. Inshallah, one day people will be standing on your shoulders, Tariq, saying, right, you know what? It was this brother that inspired me to think about travel in this way, or to think about our heritage and our history in this way. What advice would you give young aspiring creatives? I don't want to say writers or journalists, but creatives as a whole.
I think the advice that I would want to give, I wouldn't want to give it to the creatives. I think we have an abundance of creatives now, and you just have to spend a little bit of time on social media, and you'll see our young Muslims are doing the most amazing thing. The people I want to give advice to, Irfan, the people I really want to speak to, are the people in our community who have the potential to financially support these creatives,
Mm.
and I want to speak to them because one of my biggest bugbears is the fact that people don't realize that a lot of those individuals in the creative industries that are dominating the creative industries, they come from backgrounds where they are completely financially secure. In other words, many of them, this is why I mentioned earlier, most travel writers were male, middle class, and came from privileged backgrounds. They didn't need to make money from their writing. They didn't even need to purchase, they didn't even need to spend money in order to travel. This is why they were able to do this quite readily, and this is why they dominated that field.
Mhm.
If you want our community to enter these arenas, to add our voices to the spectrum, to tell our version of the same story through our lens, then you know what? We need to start doing the philanthropic work that we are not doing as a community. We are still a community, and we have many, many wealthy Muslims across this country who want to spend money for good causes. Unfortunately, at the moment, I see far too many that are only interested in pulling up. And
Mhm.
what I mean by that is helping those who are down and out on, financially and whatever else. And of course, we need to do that. Absolutely, we need to do that. But there is another form of supporting our community financially, and that is pushing up. It's not just about pulling up, we need
Pushing
to
up.
push up. And you know
Absolutely.
what? The pushing up is the longer term strategy. Okay. The pulling up, you can feed a man for a day. Yes. But if you
Yes.
teach him to fish,
He can
he
feed
can
himself.
feed himself. That's how the saying goes. And we need to invest in that side of it. So when we see creatives like people who want to become travel writers, when we see people who want to, create documentaries, create amazing films, we need to have more philanthropic work coming out of our communities where people with the wealth and the capacity, which is of course from Allah, should see this as a way of spending in the name of Allah as well. Not just because I'm feeding a poor person, which is an obvious way in which you are spending in the way of Allah, but to think of, wait, somebody is trying to do something amazing in our community, which is going to enhance and improve our community's image, which is going to help our younger people better understand their history and their heritage. That is also Allah's work.
But more
So we can
importantly,
support that too.
it allows us to own our own narrative rather than be
Absolutely.
dictated to. I think that's. We've had a question come in, Tariq. A couple of questions
Mhm.
actually. What's been your favorite country to visit so far, and why? Please describe it in 3 words.
So it would be Thailand, which is beautiful, great food, and I have a lot of affinity with them because they love dried fish.
And the next question is: if you wanted to start your Islamic European journey, where should you begin with a young family?
That's a very good one. I think with a young family, it's always better to go to places that have good travel infrastructure in place.
Uh-huh.
So maybe somewhere like Spain is a great place to start, just because it will feel familiar to Britain. Most people speak English, and of course, Spain has amazing Islamic history still standing. In the Alhambra, in the Mezquita, in Cordoba. So I would say these are good places to start. The places that I write about in my book Minarets in the Mountains, a lot of people want to go there, but unfortunately, if you're not a very well versed traveler, if you're not used to kind of having to find your way in places where the infrastructure isn't in
Being
place,
flexible
then it
enough,
can be a
yes.
bit tough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Another comment coming in from Jane, this time from Sheffield. Really interesting conversation about the arts and storytelling. So thank you very much for that comment, Jane. And Sister Sabiha is saying fascinating stuff. She's been fortunate enough to travel to Bosnia, Albania, Kosovo, and Macedonia, and hence enjoyed your book even
Oh,
more. So
how
I
wonderful.
think again, once you've been there, experienced yourself, you can really connect with what you're saying and where you're coming from. Um, so we've got 6 minutes left of the program, Tariq, and let's talk a bit about the future. What's next for you?
So next, I have some really exciting stuff going on, alhamdulillah. Obviously, the book being nominated for those kind of prizes, it puts you on the radars of people that you wouldn't normally even know exist.
Such
And
as
alhamdulillah, so off the back of it, I've managed to secure a writer in residency in Venice, which will start in the next in at the end of May, and this will be to write a small literary guide to Muslim Venice. So this is the idea of unearthing, the Venetian capital's amazing, phenomenal connections with the Muslim world. One of the most obvious was the fact that the Venetians and the Ottomans were constantly at each other's throats, but also traded and also exchanged more than just goods. You know, there was cultural exchanges as well. And people who have been following me on social media will know that I was recently in Venice, and on my stories, I gave them a little glimpse of some of the tantalizing relics and Islamic heritage that lies hidden in that city. So that's one of the projects that I'm working on. And in the background, that's been going on for quite some time since I finished Minarets. I'm doing effectively the follow up to Minarets in the Mountains, which is about a series of journeys that I took through the Mediterranean. Because, of course, whilst the Balkans and Eastern Europe is where you have the living indigenous Muslim community, Islam came to Europe as soon as Islam came to this world, and it arrived through the Mediterranean. And so I'm going back in time, and by traveling through those places, I'm going to be telling the journey of how Islam came here and effectively shaped what we call modern Europe.
Fantastic, and I'm really excited to hear that, because again, Venice, those regions you connect heavily with Catholicism and Christianity,
Absolutely.
and those sorts of things. So very, very fascinating to understand. And just going back to what you mentioned earlier about this sort of this push and pull dynamic we have around Eastern Europe, and what it's been perceived as. I suppose Turkey is a great example of that, right?
Mhm, mhm. Yes, no, absolutely. And Turkey, of course, is forever being excluded from the idea of Europe. You know, it's apparently only this side of Istanbul that is considered Europe, and even then, they have to fight for that right. And many people have raised this issue in the past and made the point that, is it because it is one of the most powerful and influential Muslim countries in the world? And I
Mm-hmm.
would argue yes, because when you travel across the Balkans, you realize the kind of allure Turkey still retains in that part of the world, because those in that part of the world, and not everybody, those Muslims that look upon their Ottoman heritage fondly, look towards Turkey, of course, as some kind of modern inheritor of that. And Turkey does a lot of work in going and restoring a lot of the Ottoman heritage across the globe, and certainly in those parts. And I think one of the fears of the quote unquote Western European community is, by allowing Turkey into our European community, what kind of influence will it have on this region in particular, where many people, like the Bosnians, for example, they see Turkey as their kind of spiritual
Mm-hmm.
home in many ways. You know, all of their imams and their muftis, they get trained in many of the Turkish places, and as well as in Bosnia, and they have this wonderful relationship with them. And so I think that's definitely another reason why Turkey is often looked at in this kind of, oh, it's not a European country at all. And of course, we know it is. It very much is a European country. And I mean, you know, so much of the heritage in that part of the world explains what's happened in what we call Europe today. So of course, it has that significance, and there is tons of Islamic heritage there that many Muslims are beginning to only now appreciate, because of the great work dramas like Ertugrul have done recently.
Yes, absolutely. We're running out of time very quickly, Tarek, so I'm just going to thank you. But before we go, I have to say I'm suffering from a bit of imposter syndrome. You know, me, who's not a trained journalist, interviewing a journalist and writer, it's kind of mind blown territory here. But please give a message to our listeners right now as we approach Eid.
Well, I would just say, just make the most of it, enjoy it, you know, and just be thankful for all the blessings that we have right now, given
Okay.
what's going on in the world.
Okay, so very last question. You have the opportunity to have an iftar with your favorite writer, past or present. Who is that?
It's got to be Ibn Battuta, hasn't it?
Yeah,
You know, just to talk to a man who saw more of the world than most people even knew existed at the time.
yeah. Okay, Brother Tariq was saying, Jazakumullah khair for your time and your insights this afternoon on Talking Heads. I'd like to take this opportunity to wish you and your whole family Eid Mubarak, a blessed Eid. You know, may the kebabs be juicy and the samosas extra crispy. And please come back again on the program, inshallah, once you've written your next book. And we look forward to hearing that. So, Assalamu alaikum, jazakallah.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you so much for having me on. Eid Mubarak to everybody out there.
Thank you. Right. Okay. So that was Brother Tariq Hussain, award-winning author, travel writer, and journalist. On tomorrow's program, we have got Sister Dr. Saraya talking about Muslim women in mosques around the country. So make sure you tune into what will hopefully be the final Talking Heads program of this Ramadan 2024. Remember, Ramadan FM will be broadcast all throughout the year, not just in Ramadan. We are on DAB channel 9, so please make sure you find us on your DAB radio and favorite it, and you can listen to more of this content throughout the year, not just in Ramadan. But until the next time, stay safe, look after yourself and each other. Assalamu alaikum.